Hello YouTube, this is Umozo3. So this is now lesson 4 of our Python curriculum, where I'm basically demonstrating my knowledge of Python concepts so that they can be helpful or maybe just at least interesting for other people. And it might also be fun for me to look back at these videos one day as well. And so what we're going to be doing is looking at the Python essentials, and we've already studied a great deal of them in the first 3 lessons. And so in lesson 0, we downloaded the PyCharm integrated development, and so that's a great software program for writing Python code. In lesson 1, we learned about how to print code, and then also about how to make comments. And we said that comments can be helpful for helping you understand your code if you haven't revisited it for a while, or for other programmers if you're leaving the software engineering company that you're working at. And then we also talked about arithmetic expressions, and we said that Python is capable of addition, multiplication, and subtraction. And we said with division, Python will always do the floating point form of it, right? So 3 over 4 is 0.75. 10 over 1 is 10.0, okay? That's unlike Java, which it just does integer divided by an integer as an integer. If you do want integer divided by an integer in Python to just get another integer, if you want integer-based division, you need to write over, okay? And so we've seen an example of that. So here I already have a few examples, but we can just take a look at the first thing that comes out here, right? So if we say 5 over 3, then this would just return 1, right? So if we go ahead and run this code, then we just get that 1 there on the top. But then if we had run 5 over 3, then of course we go ahead and get the 1.6667. That's the floating point. That's actually, in mathematics, what that decimal would be. And then we could also talk about a 5 mod 3, right? That's the remainder when you divide 5 by 3, and of course that would be 2. And then we could also talk about a 5 to the power of 3, right? So 5 times 3, and of course we would expect 125 for that. And then I'm just going to delete this because we're getting a little bit too much code here, but you can see the differences there. And then what if you had made any of these numbers a floating point number? So what if you had said 5 over 3.0? This doesn't make a difference, right? So this is still 1.6667 because 5 over 3, this doesn't change anything, right? But what if you had said print of 5 over 3.0? So this gives the floating point representation of the integer division, of 5 and 3.0. And so then what you would basically have is this would, or 5 and 3, I guess you would say, right? So 5 and 3, and then that would just go ahead and be 1.0, okay? What if you had made this, 5.6 and 3, right? This is still going to be 1.0 because there's only one full group of 3 in the number 5.6. But since you're dealing with a floating point number, this is converted to a floating point number. So we said, remember, that Python prefers decimals. It prefers floating point numbers over integers. So hopefully you're getting familiar with that. And then we also talked about escape sequences and delimiters and concatenating strings. So remember, if we just have 2 string objects, then we can just go ahead and combine them. So we could say something like this, and then this is just combining 3 strings. And that's going to be pretty helpful when we start dealing with variables in this video. So that's going to be that. And then you could go ahead and also combine the single and double quotations. So this is no problem. Okay, so then we basically have a single quote and then a double quote, and that's no problem whatsoever. And then you could also go ahead and print multiple lines by doing an escape sequence. So we said escape under \n sequence. What this backslash means, this is not going to print a \n. It says the backslash means, hey Java, I want you to do something different than you otherwise would have done with this n. And we've seen examples of that, right? We've already seen examples of delimiters where basically if you put a \, double quotes within these double quotes, within this double quoted string, you would literally just see that double quote there, right? And it wouldn't even have to be in a pair because you're telling it, oh, I just want you to print this single, this, lone double quote, and that's fine, okay? And you can have as many of those as you want in whatever order you want. And then if you put a \n here, this is going to go ahead and print a new line after it prints the double quote. So now if you go ahead and run it, you get escape, double quote, and then sequence, right? And then we also talked about the \t and how that's a tab. So now we're going to see some space in between the Q and the U. And Python enhancement proposal doesn't like that we're not really having any space here, but it doesn't know what uinst means, right? But you can basically ignore that. We could right click on it and we could tell basically Python to ignore it. So how would we do that? So you could click off of it and then you hover back over it. And then if you press more actions, and then you can go ahead and I guess you would save it to the dictionary. Okay, and then it's no problem. Because we don't care about those things, and sometimes we don't want Python to, you know, worry about those things. Sometimes we're going to have weird variable names and whatnot, and sometimes Python enhancement proposals, sometimes it tries to be helpful, but sometimes it can go a little bit overboard, and it tells us things that, you know, helpful reminders in general, but, you know, maybe you and I are the type of people that are not bothered by the particular things that it says are bad etiquette. Okay. So hopefully you can understand that. And then you can also go ahead and print a multiple line statement just by doing 3 double quotes on one line. So you could say, where the heck are you? Okay. And then you would go ahead and close that up. And then if you go ahead and run this code, then we literally in our code, we just entered new lines. And on those lines, we just have the strings that we wanted to print. And that's okay as long as you have triple quotes here. So that's kind of what we have going on here. That's kind of what essentially is happening here. And then what we're going to do, and then we also talked about concatenating strings, and we said you could multiply strings, right? And so you said we basically said you could do basically if you do Adam times 4, that would do Adam, right? And then you could also put the int in front of the string if you want. What if you tried doing it with a floating point number? You can already see a light bulb. So there might be something in this code that it doesn't like. So now if we go ahead, it's going to take a look at type checker. Okay, so it might have a problem with that. So we're going to go ahead and run it, and it says basically that we have an issue here. So it didn't print that because if you scroll up to the top, before it tried running the console output, it said that there's going to be an issue in this code. So it said that we can't multiply a sequence by a non-int, even though it's 4.0. So it has to be an int times a string, or a string plus a string. Okay, so far those are the things we know how to do. And by plus, the formal term for that is concatenation. It's concatenating 2 string objects together. But you cannot concatenate a string object with an int. So you can't do print, you know, Adam plus 3. Okay, you couldn't do that because it doesn't know how to parse that. Okay. But then if you say Adam and then you make a string out of 3, then it would just be Adam 3, because then 3 is treated not as a number, but as a letter. So hopefully that's clear to you, and those are all the things we've talked about. Let's talk about variables. Essentially, variables allow us to store information in a programming language, right? So I don't just say Python, but we learned about variables when we were talking about Java. And you're going to see variables in a lot of programming languages. You could be talking about R, you could be talking about C++, but all those languages have variables, and it can really help us store information and keep track of it. And we have the freedom to update variables as our code progresses, right? So if we start out with x equals 2, it doesn't have to keep that variable through the entire execution of the code. We could decide to double x. And then if we print x later on in the program, instead of seeing the initial value x equals 2, we would see the new value, which would be double of that. So instead we would see 4 printed on the console. So what we're going to do, we're going to use one equal sign to initialize a variable in Python. So we use an equal sign in Python to do an assignment operation. Okay, this means we are going to provide an initial value to a new variable that we want Python to keep track of. Okay, and so the format for it is going to be variable name equals initial variable value. Okay, so let's see an example of that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically make an int variable. So I'm going to say x equals 2, and then I'm going to say print of x plus 5. What this is going to do is it's going to try to print x plus 5, but it's going to say, what's x? And basically, it's already retains this information. So now x basically points to, it basically references an integer. And so now it's going to stick in the 2 there, and you should be able to predict that it's going to be able to print 7. And so this is an example of a variable. You can also have multiple variables. So we could have also said y equals 3, and then you could have said system.out.println of x, let's say x to the y. So this would be 2 to the 3rd power, and we would expect an 8 there. Okay, and so then you can see an order of operations. What if we said x times y minus y times x, okay? And so that would basically do 2 cubed minus 3 squared. So you can see a sort of an order of operations there, right? It would be the same thing like in math. If you saw x to the y minus y to the x, and then you would know what to do, okay? You wouldn't compute x to the y minus y and then take all that stuff to the x power. You would just take the y to the x power and then subtract that result from the result of x to the y. So anyway, Python knows how to do the same thing, and so you can trust it to do that. And you can have the same thin with floats. So what if you had said u equals 1.0 and z equals 8? Or I guess that's not a float, but what if you had said system.out.println? Or why am I saying that's the Java, right? So you would just say print of z plus u, right? So then we see that implicit cast again. We're reminded that if you're going to combine an int with a float, then Python is going to prefer the float. So it returns to 9.0. You can also have string variables. So what if we had a string variable to keep track of a new line? Okay, and so that would be totally legitimate. And so now if we print s, that prints a new line. Okay, and so you can basically assign variables to your escape sequences if you'd like. But maybe I'll just give a more general example. So you could say something like, hey, or you could say something like x equals pizza, y equals and then maybe you could have spaces on the and, because like we were saying, you want to space out your words here. So now we're going to see, if we try to combine these strings, we want to see spaces in between the words. And then this would be hot dogs or something, okay? And then you could set, and then what you would do is you would say print of x plus y plus z. So this concatenates 3 string variables, concatenates three string objects, okay? So now if you go ahead and run this code, it says pizza and hot dogs. So it's able to concatenate those strings exactly as we wanted it to. What if we pass in a few s's? What if we want s plus and then y plus s plus? So what does this do? This would basically apply the escape sequence in between each of these words, right? So you would get pizza and hot dogs, right? So now if you go ahead and run it, you see that. And the reason why the and is spaced out a little bit is because not only did you print a new line by adding this variable s, but you still have a space in your variable y. So it's going to do both of those things. It's not only going to print a new line, but you'll still have that space there. So that's kind of what we have going on here. And then that's kind of the use of variables. And what we were saying though, is that you cannot combine a string and an int. So basically we're going to learn a technique for combining, for changing a data type, and we're going to do that very, very shortly. So now if we go ahead and say an a there, now if we just wanted to print a 3, it would have a problem with doing that. But that's kind of the use of variables, and now we've done that for ints, doubles, and strings, which are basically the 3 data types that we've talked about this far. Pretty soon we're going to be talking about Booleans, which are used in if-else logic. Those correspond to true and false values, and certainly we can have variables for Boolean values as well. We simply just call them Boolean variables. Okay, so let's talk about data type conversions. What we're going to do is we're basically going to say that we can explicitly convert, so we can explicitly convert a data type of a variable, or a constant to another data type. And what we do is we say int of x converts x to the integer form of x. So let me give you an example of that. What we're going to do is we're going to say print int of 3.2. What this does is it's going to print the integer form of the float 3.2. And so you can guess that it's just going to basically give us the 3 there. And so now if we run it, we just get 3. And so this is an example of a data type conversion from a float to an int. What if you wanted to go from a string to an int? So what if you had a string representation of a number and you wanted to get a number out of it? So what if you had basically int of 10 times int of 10.111? What would this code do? When we apply int and we accept a string object, it's going to basically convert that string into an int. And then here it's going to convert the float into an int. And so here we would be expecting 100 because 10 times 10 is 100. You could also do an int of itself, right? So you could say basically int of 4, right? And obviously that would just return 4. So that's basically passing one data type into another, right? So if you say b equals 3.2 and c equals int of b, right? And then what if you say d equals float. Now, well, yeah, so then you can go ahead and say now print of C, right? And so now this is just going to go ahead and print 3 there on the 4th line because we were already printing 3 things here. Okay. We can also do the float of something. Okay, so what if you do, you know, so now we can go ahead and say float of X converts X to the float form of X, the decimal representation. So now you could go ahead and say, what if you say print float of 5, right? And so you can guess that this would print 5.0, okay? What if you say float of 24 times 4, right? That would evaluate 24 times 4 and then just convert that result to 96.0, right? And then what if you had float of a string? What if you have float of what if you have float of 5.65 and then you want plus 0.2? So what this is going to do is it's going to accept a string and it's going to convert it to a float. So we can convert. We saw the same thing for the we saw the same thing in the int case, right? But we can convert a string representation of a float to a float. And you can guess that if you tried doing float of a string that wasn't showing a you know, a float number, then it would have an issue with that. So it would be 5.85, right? And then you can see the rounding thing again. But 5.65 plus 0.2 is 5.85. And obviously, if you had just tried saying 5.65 there, that's string plus 0.2, it would have a big problem with that. So hopefully you can understand what's going on with that. And then you could also have, you know, that you could have float of itself. So you could say, you know, y equals 2.2, and then you could say, you know, you could say z equals float of y. And then if you go ahead and say print of y minus z, well, the float of a float is that float. So it would just be 0.0, okay? So hopefully you can understand that. And then you could also have string of x, okay? String of x converts x to the string form of x. And this would allow you to combine numbers with strings, okay? So now what you would do is basically, remember we say I am, if you say I am plus 32, it would have a problem with that because 32 is a number, but I am is a string. But what if you had said string of 32 and you had concatenated this string with the string representation of 32? Then you can say I am 32. Okay, so you can hopefully understand with what's going on with that. Okay, so and then you could do this. What if you do a string of a string, right? So you could do the same thing. You could do what if you do string of sup, right? It would just return that string. String of a string is a string, just like the float of a float is a float, just like the int of an int is an int. Okay, and you can do the string of a float as well. So we were saying, what about the string of 3.2 plus 6, 7, right? So now it would be able to make a string out of the whole thing, and you'd be able to combine it. So this would be a string. This would basically be letters, right? It would be, and it would just say 3.267, but that would not be treated as a number. So now if you try to add that 3.267 thing to 1, it would have a problem with that because you cannot combine this integer 1 with this string here, okay? And then the last thing I'm going to say is that you can reassign a value after you've already created it. And I'm going to say more about that in the next video. But you can reassign variables. And so basically, if you have y equals 2, you could basically say y equals 10. And then if you say print of y, you would not get 2, you would get 10 because that was the most recent value of y. Okay, same thing with strings. What if you had said something like r equals apples, and then you had said r equals r concatenated with and? So in the next video, what we're going to be exploring is that you can actually redefine the value of a variable according to the existing value of a variable. And we're going to be exploring that. I want to do a little bit more of a review with the variables and the data type conversions. But hopefully you got a decently comprehensive overview here. But you could go ahead and combine this string, right? So you could say something like x equals r plus and oranges, right? And then you can just go ahead and concatenate these things. And so if you go ahead and redefine it, then that would not be a problem. So you could say print of r now, and what it does is it basically reassigns r to the original r, which is just the word apples, and then concatenates on and oranges. So now you get the entire thing. And I think we had 2 spaces there by accident. But that's what's going on here. So those are variables. It allows you to store information. We can print variables, use them. You can see how they might be helpful. And then we can also have data type conversions, which we're going to review a little bit more, and also talk a little bit more about just reassigning variables in general. So from Emails03, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.